In Module 42, we're going to look at major depressive disorder and bipolar disorder. How do major depressive disorder and bipolar disorder differ? Major depressive disorder is a prolonged state of hopelessness or depression. Bipolar disorder, formerly called manic depressive disorder, alternates between depression and overexcited hyperactivity. Symptoms for these disorders may have a seasonal pattern. Depression protects us from dangerous thoughts and feelings, letting us slow down. Reassessing life may redirect our energy in promising ways, and even mild sadness can be helpful sometimes. However, depression can be seriously maladaptive and disabling to our everyday lives. Major depressive disorder is defined as a disorder in which a person experiences 2 or more weeks with 5 or more symptoms, at least one of which must be depressed mood or loss of interest or pleasure. These symptoms present themselves in the absence of drugs or another medical condition. Phobias are more common, but depression is the #1 reason people seek help for mental health. In the United States, 7.6% experience moderate or severe depression. Worldwide, 3.9% men and 7.2% women have a depressive episode. When we look at diagnosing major depressive disorder, we look at a depressed mood most of the time, dramatically reduced interest or enjoyment in most activities most of the time, significant challenges regulating their appetite and weight, significant challenges regulating sleep, physical agitation or lethargy, feeling listless or with much less energy, feeling worthless or feeling unwarranted guilt, problems in thinking, concentrating or making decisions, thinking repetitively of death and suicide. Bipolar disorder is a disorder in which a person alternates between the hopelessness and lethargy of depression and the overexcited state of mania. Formerly called manic depressive disorder, we define mania in bipolar disorder as a hyperactive, wildly optimistic state in which dangerously poor judgment is common. Mild mania, however, can fuel creativity. It strikes more often among those who rely on emotional expression and vivid imagery. It is much less common than major depressive disorder, but often more dysfunctional, and Americans twice as likely as people elsewhere to be diagnosed with this disorder. And new to the DSM-5 is a different term called disruptive mood dysregulation disorder. 42-2, how can the biological and social cognitive perspectives help us understand major depressive disorder and bipolar disorder? Any theory of depression must explain at least the following 6 phenomena. Behaviors and thoughts change with depression, that is, negative aspects on environment consume the depressed. Nearly half of people diagnosed with depression also display symptoms of another disorder, such as anxiety or substance abuse. It should be noted at this point that such diagnoses are considered comorbid, so many disorders are comorbid, such as mild depressive disorder as well as ADHD are typically comorbid, as well as anxiety disorder. Second is depression is widespread. It is found worldwide. Its causes must also be common. Third, women's risk of major depressive disorder is nearly double men's. Women experience depression 1.7 times more often than men. Women's disorders are generally more internal: depression, anxiety, inhibited sexual desire. Men's disorders are more external: alcohol use disorder, antisocial conduct, lack of impulse control. Fourth, most major depressive disorders end on their own. Therapy often helps and tends to speed recovery, but even without, most people recover. Recovery is more likely if the first episode strikes later in life. There were few previous episodes and there is minimal stress and a strong social support system. Fifth, stressful events often precede depression. About 1 in 4 diagnosed with a depression have experienced an emotional, financial, or professional trauma within the past month. Moving to a new culture may also lead to depression. And lastly, with each generation, depression strikes earlier, now often in the late teens, and affects more people, with the highest rates among young adults in developed countries. In North America, young adults are 3 times more likely than their grandparents to suffer, recently or ever, from depression. Some generational affect young people now more willing to talk openly about their depression. What is the relationship between genes and depression? The risk for major depressive disorder and bipolar disorder increases if a family member has the disorder. Twin studies estimated heritability, the extent to which individual differences are attributable to genes, of major depression at 37%. Linkage analysis points to chromosome neighborhood to help researchers tease out the genes that put people at risk of depression. Many genes work together and produce interacting small effects that increase the risk of depression. This part actually kind of helps us understand why the heritability is only approximately 37%. If you look at this chart from the Myers-Sachs, it lists the heritability of various psychological disorders, with bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, anorexia nervosa being the highest. As you can see, major depressive disorder and generalized anxiety disorder are less than 50% heritable. What does it mean that the brain is depressed? Brain activity slows during depression, increasing during the mania stage for those with bipolar disorder. The left frontal lobe and adjacent reward center become more active during positive emotions. The neurotransmitter norepinephrine is scarce during depression and overabundant during mania. The neurotransmitter serotonin is scarce and inactive during depression. Depression-relieving drugs increase serotonin supplies, especially within the synaptic gap. One of the challenges is that too much serotonin is taken back into sending neurons, not leaving enough in the synaptic gap to facilitate the next brain signal. Repetitive physical exercises decreases depression by increasing serotonin. The nutritional effects. What's good for the heart is also good for the brain and mind. People who eat heart healthy, such as the Mediterranean diet, heavy on vegetables, fish, and olive oil, have a comparatively low risk of depression as well as lower risk for many other ailments. Excessive alcohol use correlates with depression, and alcohol misuse in fact leads to depression. From the social cognitive perspective, the biological influences contribute to depression, but our life experiences also play a part. Our thinking matters. People's assumptions and expectations influence what they perceive. Many depressed people have low self-esteem, holding negative views of themselves, their situation, and their future. Their self-defeating beliefs and negative explanatory style often feed depression's vicious cycle. Our negative thoughts and our negative moods can interact. Learned helplessness is the term that exists when self-defeating beliefs, self-focused rumination, and self-blaming and pessimistic explanatory style guide behavior. This is found more often in women than men, who may tend to respond more strongly to stress. Rumination is this compulsive fretting or overthinking about our problems and their causes. It can divert us from thinking about other life tasks, and it often increases our negative moods. Critics note the chicken and egg problem with the social cognitive explanation of depression. Which comes first, the pessimistic explanatory style or the depressed mood? In this example of the explanatory style in depression, we look up the breakup with a romantic partner. The stable, I'll never get over this. Global, without my partner, I can't seem to do anything right. Internal, our breakup was all my fault, and at the end we have depression. The other side would be temporary. This is hard to take, but I will get through this. Specific, I miss my partner, but thankfully I have family and other friends. External, it takes two to make a relationship work, and it wasn't meant to be. And the last is the ending of successful coping. So you can see the different type of style and how this may actually result in very different outcomes. Depression is a cycle, and pieces of this depression puzzle include how stressful events are interpreted through our brooding, negative explanatory style that creates a hopeless, depressed state that hampers the way the person thinks and acts. These thoughts and actions in turn fuel number one, and the cycle continues. In this figure, we see the vicious cycle of depressed thinking. We have stressful experiences, which lead to the use of a negative explanatory style, which leads to our depressed mood. Then we have cognitive behavioral changes, and then that may come back to stressful experiences again, since these changes are typically negative in nature. One of the most challenging parts of depression is when people are severely depressed. They may choose to engage in harm to themselves. So when we look at the factors that increase the risk of suicide, and what do we know about non-suicidal self-injury, we know that worldwide about 800,000 people take their own lives. at least 5 times higher risk for suicide with a diagnosis of depression, and ironically, it may especially occur when people are beginning to rebound, when they become capable of following through. It is more likely to occur when people feel disconnected from or a burden to others, or when they feel defeated and trapped by an inescapable situation. Comparing the suicide rates of different groups, researchers have found there are national differences, racial differences, gender differences, age differences and trends, other group differences, and even day of the week differences when people may attempt to commit suicide. How to help a family member or friend who is talking suicide. There are 3 tips. The first is to listen, offering sincere empathy rather than arguments for why suicide is not the answer, is to connect by doing your best to link those at risk with a helpline or with campus health services, and to protect by seeking help right away, a doctor, emergency room, or 911, and removing potential tools for suicide such as weapons or medications for anyone appearing in immediate risk. The other part of this is non-suicidal self-injury, NSSI, which includes cutting, burning, hitting oneself, inserting objects under nails or skin, or self-administering tattooing. These self-injuries are painful, but they are not fatal. People who engage in NSSI tend to gain relief from the intense negative thoughts through the distraction of pain. They ask for help and gain attention. They relieve guilt by self-punishment, and they get others to change their negative behavior, such as bullying or criticism, and fit in with a peer group. Typically are suicide gesturers, not suicide attempters. There's also a link between social media use and people with NSSI, where they have formed groups in different social media outlets such as Instagram, where they actually connect to others who are also engaging in NSSI. And finally, we look at the self-injury rates where they peak, and they're higher for females than males. You can see for 100,000 people, we're at about 420 for females, and in males, we're a little about 260 or 255 per 100,000 people. And you can see during the teenage years, during this period when we are looking at the brain's cognitive maturity occurring, these are when the increases are most dramatic, as well as where they peak. As you can see, as we get older, they start to slow down. This brings us to the end of Module 42. I hope you've enjoyed learning more about these types of specific disorders. And in the next part of the course, when we get to next week, we will start to talk about therapy and how we help individuals with specific disorders.